Sometimes the most dangerous people in the world look exactly like your neighbor. They shop for groceries, tend their gardens, and wave politely when you pass by their fence. They blend into small towns so perfectly that nobody suspects the truth lurking beneath their quiet exterior. But what happens when someone tries to take everything away from a person who once held a sniper rifle in the mountains of Afghanistan, whose hands have steadied crosshairs on targets 1,000 yards away, and whose military record remains classified to this day? The residents of Pine Ridge thought they knew Margaret Maggie Sullivan. She was the woman who lived alone in the old farmhouse at the end of Maple Road, who kept to herself, paid her taxes on time, and never caused any trouble. They had no idea they were about to witness what happens when you corner a predator who has spent years pretending to be prey. This is the true story of how a small town discovered that their quietest resident was actually one of the deadliest women alive, and how a land grab scheme turned into something nobody could have predicted. Margaret Sullivan had been living in Pine Ridge for 8 years, and in all that time she had spoken fewer words to her neighbors than most people spoke in a single conversation. The 42-year-old woman kept to herself in the old farmhouse that sat on 12 acres of prime real estate at the edge of town, where rolling hills met the state forest and morning mist hung low over untouched meadows. The house itself told a story of careful maintenance and practical living. The white clapboard siding was always freshly painted, the wraparound porch swept clean of leaves, and the vegetable garden behind the house grew in perfect rows that looked almost military in their precision. Neighbors who drove past on their way to work would sometimes glimpse her tending to tomatoes or hanging laundry on the line, moving with an economy of motion that suggested someone who wasted neither time nor energy. What struck people most about Maggie Sullivan was how unremarkable she appeared to be. Average height, brown hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and flannel shirts that had seen better days. She drove a 10-year-old pickup truck that never broke down, shopped for groceries on Tuesday mornings when the store was least crowded, and paid for everything in cash. The checkout clerks at Pine Ridge Market knew her by sight but not by name, and their attempts at small talk were always met with polite but brief responses. The mailman, Jimmy Torres, was probably the person who interacted with her most regularly, and even he knew little about her personal life. She would emerge from the house as his truck approached, accept her mail with a quiet thank you, and disappear back inside. Jimmy noticed that she received very little personal correspondence, mostly bills and the occasional package from outdoor equipment companies. No birthday cards, no letters from family, no magazines except for a subscription to something called Precision Shooting that arrived monthly in a plain brown wrapper. Dr. Sarah Kim, who ran the only medical practice in town, had seen Maggie Sullivan exactly twice in 8 years. Both visits were for routine matters, a physical exam required for some paperwork, and a prescription refill that she never explained. Dr. Kim remembered being struck by her patient's unusual physique for a woman in her 40s. Maggie was lean but muscular, with calloused hands and small scars on her arms and legs that suggested an active outdoor life. When asked about her medical history, she provided only the basics and deflected questions about her occupation by saying she was between jobs. The mystery of what Maggie Sullivan did for work was a source of mild speculation among the townspeople. She seemed to have enough money to maintain her property and pay her bills, but nobody had ever seen her leave for work or return home at regular hours. Some theorized that she worked from home, others thought she might be living off an inheritance or disability payments. The truth was that Maggie received a monthly check from the Department of Veterans Affairs, but this fact wasn't common knowledge in Pine Ridge. Her interactions with local businesses were always professional but minimal. At Henderson's hardware store, she would purchase items like fence posts, tools, and ammunition for hunting with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything else about her life. Bob Henderson, the store owner, noted that she always knew exactly what she wanted and never needed advice or recommendations. She paid in cash, thanked him politely, and left. The Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department had no records of any incidents involving Maggie Sullivan. Deputy Chief Maria Santos had driven past her property countless times on patrol and never observed anything suspicious. The house was always dark by 10 in the evening. Lights came on at dawn, and she never had visitors or parties. It was the kind of law-abiding, trouble-free residence that police officers appreciated, in a small town where their biggest concerns were usually teenagers drinking in the woods or disputes between neighbors over property lines. What none of the townspeople realized was that Maggie Sullivan woke up every morning at 0500 hours, a habit ingrained by 15 years of military service that she had never shaken. She would begin each day with a 3-mile run through the state forest behind her property, moving silently along deer paths that most people didn't even know existed. Her route took her through terrain that varied from flat meadows to steep hills, and she covered the distance in under 24 minutes, a pace that would have impressed marathon runners half her age. After her run, she would spend an hour in what had once been the farmhouse's root cellar, but now served as her personal gym. She had equipped the space with basic weight equipment, a punching bag, and exercise mats, creating a training facility that allowed her to maintain the physical conditioning that had been essential to her survival in another life. The routine never varied: calisthenics, weight training, and combat exercises that kept her reflexes sharp and her body ready for threats that might never come. The most telling aspect of Maggie's daily routine was something that no neighbor ever witnessed. Every afternoon, after completing whatever maintenance work her property required, she would disappear into the converted barn behind her house. The building had been reinforced with soundproofing materials, and what appeared to be farming equipment from the outside was actually something entirely different. Inside the barn, Maggie had constructed a shooting range that met military specifications. The facility stretched for 100 yards and was equipped with paper targets, steel plates, and electronic scoring systems that could measure accuracy to within fractions of an inch. 3 times a week, she would spend 2 hours there, practicing with rifles that most civilians never saw outside of action movies. Her favorite was a custom-built .300 Winchester Magnum that could accurately engage targets at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. The neighbors occasionally heard what sounded like construction work coming from the direction of her property, but the sounds were muffled enough that nobody thought to investigate. The timing of her practice sessions was carefully planned to coincide with periods when most people were at work or busy with their own activities. She had studied the patterns of her neighbors' lives with the same attention to detail that she had once applied to enemy movements in hostile territory. Maggie's past was something that she had worked hard to leave behind, but it remained visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The way she positioned herself in public spaces always provided multiple exit routes and clear sight lines. Her tendency to avoid crowds and her preference for conducting business during off-peak hours weren't antisocial quirks, but tactical choices made by someone who had learned that survival often depended on avoiding predictable patterns. The scars on her body told stories that she never shared with Dr. Kim or anyone else in Pine Ridge. The thin white line across her left shoulder blade came from shrapnel that had missed her heart by inches during an ambush outside Kandahar. The surgical scars on her right knee were the result of a parachuting accident during a training exercise that had ended her military career sooner than planned. The small round mark on her forearm was a burn from a rifle barrel that had overheated during a 12-hour firefight in the mountains of Afghanistan. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Maggie's hidden past was her military occupational specialty, a designation that remained classified years after her discharge. She had been what the military called a Special Operations Forces sniper, one of fewer than 50 women who had ever qualified for such a position. Her confirmed kill count remained locked in files that most Pentagon officials weren't authorized to access, but the number was sufficient to earn her a reputation among special operations communities that still spoke her name with respect and a certain degree of awe. The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than she had anticipated. The skills that had made her invaluable in military operations were not easily translated to peacetime occupations, and the psychological adjustment to a world without constant threat assessment and mission planning had taken years. Pine Ridge represented her attempt to find peace in routine, to create a life where her greatest challenge was deciding which vegetables to plant each spring. For 8 years, this strategy had worked perfectly. She had found contentment in the simple rhythms of rural life, had even begun to believe that she might be able to completely leave her past behind. She maintained her training and conditioning more out of habit than necessity, convinced that she would never again need the skills that had once defined her existence. The first sign that her quiet life was about to change came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when a black sedan with tinted windows drove slowly past her property 3 times before parking at the end of her driveway. Maggie observed the vehicle from her kitchen window, noting the out-of-state license plates and the way the occupants remained inside the car for nearly 20 minutes before finally driving away. Later that afternoon, she found a business card wedged into her front door frame. The card identified a company called Summit Development Group and included a phone number with a metropolitan area code. There was no message, but Maggie understood that someone wanted to discuss business with her. She researched the company online and discovered that Summit Development specialized in large-scale residential and commercial construction projects, the kind that required substantial amounts of land and often resulted in the transformation of rural areas into suburban developments. The second visit came 3 days later, this time with the occupants actually getting out of their car. Maggie watched from her living room window as two men in expensive suits walked up to her front door and knocked loudly enough to be heard throughout the house. When she didn't answer, they spent several minutes examining her property, taking photographs and making notes on clipboards before returning to their vehicle and driving away. That evening, Maggie called the number on the business card and spoke briefly with a receptionist, who informed her that Mr. Richard Thornton, Summit Development's acquisition specialist, would very much like to schedule a meeting to discuss a business opportunity that would be mutually beneficial. The receptionist was professionally friendly but persistent, and when Maggie declined to schedule an immediate appointment, she was told that Mr. Thornton would be in the area for the rest of the week and would be happy to accommodate her schedule. The third encounter was different from the previous two, and it set off alarm bells that Maggie had hoped never to hear again. She was returning from her weekly grocery shopping trip when she noticed the same black sedan parked on a side road that provided an elevated view of her property. As she turned into her driveway, she observed the vehicle through her rear-view mirror and saw something that made her blood run cold. The man in the passenger seat was using binoculars to observe her house, and his posture and scanning pattern indicated professional surveillance training. This wasn't a real estate developer conducting casual property assessment. This was reconnaissance of the type that preceded military or law enforcement operations. Maggie continued driving normally until she reached her garage, but once inside her house, she immediately began implementing security protocols that she hadn't used in 8 years. That night, Maggie didn't sleep. Instead, she spent the hours of darkness conducting counter-surveillance of her own property, using night vision equipment that she kept stored in a hidden compartment beneath her bedroom floor. She identified 3 different positions around her property where someone could maintain visual observation of her house while remaining concealed, and she noted fresh tire tracks on a logging road that ran along the eastern boundary of her land. By morning, she had reached a conclusion that both frightened and angered her. Someone was planning to take her home, and they were prepared to use methods that went far beyond normal business negotiations. The question that remained was whether they knew who they were dealing with, or if they had made the potentially fatal mistake of assuming that Margaret Sullivan was just another quiet woman who would be easily intimidated. As the sun rose over Pine Ridge, casting long shadows across the peaceful meadows that surrounded her property, Maggie began preparing for a conflict that would test every skill she had learned in 15 years of military service. She had hoped that part of her life was over forever, but as she cleaned and inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, she realized that some battles choose you whether you want them or not. The quiet woman of Pine Ridge was about to remind the world that silence and lethality often walked hand in hand. The phone call came at exactly 7:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, early enough to catch most people off guard, but late enough to seem respectful of normal business hours. Maggie had been awake for 2.5 hours, had completed her morning run, and was finishing her second cup of coffee when the telephone's harsh ring cut through the quiet of her kitchen.
Miss Sullivan, this is Richard Thornton from Summit Development Group.
I believe my office has been trying to reach you regarding a business proposition that I think you'll find very attractive. The voice was smooth and confident, with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and persistence. Maggie had heard similar voices before, usually belonging to military contractors and government officials who were skilled at making threats sound like opportunities. I'm not interested in selling my property, Mr. Thornton. I appreciate your directness, Miss Sullivan, but I don't think you understand the scope of what we're offering. This isn't just about your 12 acres. Summit Development is planning a comprehensive redevelopment of the entire Pine Ridge area. We're talking about bringing jobs, modern infrastructure, and significant economic growth to a community that frankly has been stagnating for years. Maggie walked to her kitchen window and scanned the tree line that bordered her property. The black sedan wasn't visible, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Professional surveillance teams knew how to remain hidden when necessary. And if I choose not to participate in this redevelopment? There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long, and when Thornton spoke again, his voice had lost some of its manufactured warmth.
Sullivan, I think you'll find that the financial offer we're prepared to make will be more than generous.
We're talking about a price that's significantly above current market value for rural property in this area. But I should mention that this opportunity won't be available indefinitely. Development projects like this require coordinated acquisition of multiple properties, and there are time constraints that we need to work within. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maggie had heard similar language in military briefings when commanders were explaining why certain objectives needed to be accomplished regardless of local resistance. I'll need to see a formal offer in writing before I consider anything.
Of course.
I'll have our legal team prepare the documentation. In fact, I'd like to deliver it personally and give you a chance to ask any questions you might have. Would this afternoon be convenient? Maggie agreed to a 3 p.m. meeting, not because she had any intention of selling her property, but because she needed to assess exactly what kind of threat she was facing. After ending the call, she spent 30 minutes conducting a detailed reconnaissance of her property's perimeter, using techniques that had kept her alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. What she discovered confirmed her worst suspicions. The surveillance wasn't limited to the black sedan she had observed earlier. Someone had been moving through the woods around her property on foot, and they had done so with enough skill to avoid detection by most people. But Maggie wasn't most people, and she could read sign in the forest the way others read books. Boot prints in soft earth near her eastern property line showed a tread pattern consistent with military or law enforcement footwear. The person had been moving carefully, but not carefully enough to avoid leaving traces that someone with her training could identify. More troubling was the discovery of a small electronic device attached to a tree roughly 200 yards from her house. The device was designed to look like a birdhouse, but Maggie recognized it as a motion detection sensor, of the type used for perimeter security by military units. Someone was treating her property like a target that needed to be surveilled before an assault, and they were using equipment and techniques that suggested serious funding and professional expertise. This wasn't a simple case of aggressive real estate development. This was something that went much deeper and carried implications that extended far beyond property values. Maggie spent the rest of the morning making preparations that she hoped wouldn't be necessary. She retrieved weapons and equipment from hidden caches throughout her house, checked ammunition supplies that she had maintained but never expected to use, and activated communication protocols that connected her to networks she hadn't accessed in years. The phone call to her former commanding officer was brief and coded in language that would mean nothing to anyone monitoring the line, but would convey everything necessary to someone who understood her background. Colonel Morrison, this is Margaret Sullivan. I'm calling about that fishing trip we discussed. I think I might need to use that cabin you mentioned after all. Colonel James Morrison had been her commanding officer during her last deployment, and he was one of the few people who understood exactly how dangerous she could be when circumstances required it. His response was immediate and concerned. Maggie, talk to me. What's the situation? Someone's taking an unusual interest in my retirement property. They seem to have resources and knowledge that goes beyond normal business activities. I may need to remind them that some purchases aren't for sale at any price. There was silence on the line for nearly 10 seconds before Morrison spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications of what she was telling him. Are you sure about this? If you're right, and someone is targeting you specifically because of your background, then we're looking at something that goes way beyond local real estate issues. I'm sure, Colonel. The question is how far I should let this develop before I take action to protect myself. Don't do anything precipitous. Let me make some calls and see if I can find out what Summit Development Group really is and who's backing them. But Maggie, if things go sideways, you know I'll have your back. You've got people who remember what you did for this country, and we don't forget our own. The conversation ended with arrangements for Maggie to check in every 12 hours and protocols for emergency contact if the situation escalated beyond her ability to handle alone. For the first time in 8 years, she felt connected to the network of professionals who understood that sometimes violence was the only language that certain people understood. At exactly 3 p.m., a different vehicle turned into Maggie's driveway. This time it was a white luxury sedan with 2 occupants, both wearing suits that probably cost more than most Pine Ridge residents made in a month. The car stopped near her front porch, and 2 men got out with the confident posture of people who were accustomed to getting their way. Richard Thornton was younger than his voice had suggested, probably in his early 40s, with perfectly styled hair and the kind of tan that came from expensive vacations rather than outdoor work. His companion was older and larger, with the build of someone who spent considerable time in the gym and the alert posture of a bodyguard or security specialist. Maggie watched them approach from her kitchen window, noting details that most people would miss. Thornton moved with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced serious physical danger, but his companion was different. The larger man's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, his hand remained close to a concealed weapon beneath his jacket, and his positioning relative to Thornton suggested professional protection training. When they knocked on her door, Maggie took her time answering, using the delay to observe their reactions and gather additional intelligence. Thornton showed signs of impatience, checking his watch and adjusting his tie while his companion remained motionless and alert. "Ms. Sullivan, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I'm Richard Thornton, and this is my associate, Mr. Guy Davis." Davis didn't speak or offer to shake hands. He positioned himself where he could observe both Maggie and the approaches to her property, and she noticed that his jacket was cut to accommodate shoulder holster access. "Please, come in." Maggie led them to her living room, deliberately choosing seating arrangements that would give her tactical advantages while appearing to be simple hospitality. She offered coffee, which Thornton accepted and Davis declined, and then settled into a chair that provided clear sight lines to all windows and doors. "Sullivan, I want to be direct with you because I believe you appreciate honesty. Summit Development Group has been contracted to acquire approximately 800 acres in this area for a client who wishes to develop a luxury resort and residential community. Your property is unfortunately located in the center of the acquisition zone, which makes it absolutely essential to our plans." Thornton opened a briefcase and removed a folder thick with legal documents. The offer letter on top showed a dollar amount that was indeed well above market value for rural property, but Maggie barely glanced at the number. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Thornton, but as I told you this morning, I'm not interested in selling. I understand your attachment to this place, but I hope you'll consider the broader implications of your decision. Development projects of this scope bring significant benefits to entire communities: new jobs, increased tax revenues, improved infrastructure. Sometimes individual preferences need to be weighed against the greater good." The phrase "greater good" was one that Maggie had heard before, usually from people who were about to justify actions that served their own interests at the expense of others. She leaned back in her chair and studied Davis more carefully, noting details that confirmed her initial assessment. The man was armed with at least 2 weapons, possibly 3. His shoes showed wear patterns consistent with tactical training, and he had small scars on his knuckles that suggested extensive combat experience. Most tellingly, he positioned himself to cover exits and maintain visual contact with potential threats, behaviors that indicated military or law enforcement background. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate your offer, but my answer remains the same. I'm not selling my property." Thornton's expression shifted subtly, and for a moment the mask of professional courtesy slipped to reveal something harder underneath. "Ms. Sullivan, I hope you understand that this project will proceed with or without your cooperation. Property acquisition for developments of this scope sometimes involves eminent domain proceedings, environmental regulations, zoning changes, and other legal mechanisms that can be challenging for individual property owners to navigate." The threat was no longer subtle. Thornton was telling her that if she didn't sell voluntarily, they would find ways to force her off her land through legal and regulatory pressure. But there was something else in his tone, an edge that suggested they were prepared to use methods that went beyond legal channels if necessary. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Thornton?" "Not at all. I'm simply explaining the realities of large-scale development projects. But I should mention that we've done extensive research on this area and its residents. We understand that you live alone, that you have limited local connections, and that you might not have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle against a well-funded development corporation." Davis shifted slightly in his chair, and Maggie caught a glimpse of the weapon beneath his jacket. It was a compact pistol in a professional-grade holster,
the kind favored by people who knew how to use firearms for more than intimidation. I think this meeting is over, Mr. Goss. Thornton. I hope you'll reconsider, Ms. Sullivan. We'll leave this offer open for 1 week, but after that, the terms may become significantly less favorable. As they prepared to leave, Davis spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an accent that suggested Eastern European origins. Nice property you have here, Miss Sullivan. Very isolated. Must be peaceful, living so far from your neighbors. The comment was delivered with the kind of casual menace that professional intimidators use to plant seeds of fear. Davis wanted her to understand that her isolation made her vulnerable, that help would be far away if trouble came calling. Maggie walked them to the door and watched as they drove away, noting the direction they traveled and the license plate number of their vehicle. As soon as they were out of sight, she began implementing security measures that transformed her peaceful farmhouse into something approaching a military outpost. Motion detectors were placed around her property perimeter, connected to a monitoring system that would alert her to any approach after dark. Weapons were positioned at strategic locations throughout the house, with ammunition caches placed where they could be quickly accessed from multiple defensive positions. Communication equipment was tested and backup power systems activated. But most importantly, Maggie began planning responses to various threat scenarios, drawing on 15 years of military experience to anticipate how an assault on her property might develop. She had hoped that her quiet life in Pine Ridge would never require such preparations, but as she cleaned her rifles and calculated firing solutions for different approach routes, she felt a familiar calm settling over her. The men who had visited her that afternoon had made a critical error in their threat assessment. They had assumed that Margaret Sullivan was just another isolated homeowner who could be bullied into compliance through intimidation and legal pressure. They had no idea that they were dealing with someone who had survived firefights in Afghanistan, who had killed enemy combatants at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, and who had been trained by the best military instructors in the world to eliminate threats with precision and efficiency. As darkness fell over Pine Ridge, Maggie settled into a defensive routine that she hadn't used in years but had never forgotten. She would sleep in shifts, maintain constant surveillance of her property, and prepare for whatever form of escalation Thornton and his associates might attempt next. The quiet woman was no longer quiet. She was a predator preparing for battle, and anyone who threatened her home was about to discover that some prey could become very dangerous when cornered. The harassment began exactly 48 hours after Thornton's visit, with a precision that confirmed Maggie's suspicions about the professional nature of the organization she was facing. It started small, almost subtly, with the kind of pressure tactics that were designed to seem like coincidences to anyone not trained to recognize coordinated intimidation campaigns. Her internet service went down on Saturday morning, apparently due to a damaged cable that the repair technician claimed had been cut by vandals or maybe a large animal. The same technician mentioned that several other properties in the area had experienced similar problems recently. All of them owned by people who had declined to sell to Summit Development Group. When Maggie asked for clarification, the technician suddenly became evasive and left quickly after completing a rushed repair job. Sunday brought a visit from the county building inspector, who arrived without appointment to conduct what he called a routine compliance check on her property. The inspector, a nervous man named Peterson, who had never shown any interest in her homestead during the 8 years she had lived there, suddenly discovered numerous code violations that he claimed needed immediate attention. The septic system needed updating. The electrical work in the barn was supposedly substandard, and her water well required expensive testing for contamination. Peterson handed her a list of citations that would cost thousands of dollars to address, and carried the threat of having her property condemned if the work wasn't completed within 30 days. When Maggie asked why these issues had never been raised before, Peterson avoided eye contact and mumbled something about new environmental regulations before leaving in obvious haste. Monday morning brought the most direct threat yet. Maggie was returning from her regular 3-mile run through the state forest when she noticed fresh tire tracks in her driveway, leading right up to her front porch. Someone had been on her property while she was away, and they had wanted her to know it. The front door was still locked, and her security system showed no evidence of entry, but there was a manila envelope wedged under her doormat. Inside was a single photograph that made her blood run cold. The image showed her house taken from an elevated position, probably from the hills to the east.
and someone had used a red marker to draw crosshairs over her bedroom window. There was no note, no signature, no return address. The message was clear enough without words. We can reach you whenever we want, and we know exactly where to find you. That afternoon, Maggie received a phone call from her bank in town. The manager, Linda Patterson, sounded confused and apologetic as she explained that there had been some kind of mix-up with Maggie's accounts. "Sullivan, I'm calling because we've received some paperwork suggesting that there might be liens or judgments against your property that could affect your banking relationship with us. Now, I know that doesn't sound right, but I'm required to freeze your accounts until we can sort this out. I'm sure it's just a bureaucratic error, but these things can take weeks to resolve." Maggie's checking and savings accounts, which contained enough money to live comfortably for several years, were suddenly inaccessible. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Linda Patterson's obvious discomfort suggested that she knew the freeze wasn't the result of any legitimate legal action. That evening, Maggie called Colonel Morrison from a secure phone line that couldn't be easily monitored. "Colonel, they're escalating faster than I expected. Financial pressure, regulatory harassment, and direct threats. This isn't just about forcing me to sell. They're trying to isolate me and make me desperate." Morrison's voice was grim when he responded. "I've been making inquiries about Summit Development Group. What I'm finding isn't good, Maggie. The company exists, but it's a shell organization with connections to some very questionable people. There are ties to money laundering, international development schemes, and at least 2 cases where property owners who refused to sell ended up dead under suspicious circumstances." The confirmation of her worst fears sent a chill down Maggie's spine, but it also activated training and instincts that she had hoped never to use again. "Colonel, I need to know everything you can find out about the people I'm dealing with. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, I need intelligence on their capabilities, their methods, and their weaknesses. I'm already working on it. But Maggie, you need to understand that if these people are who I think they are, you're not just dealing with corporate intimidation. You could be facing organized crime, international criminal networks, or worse. Are you sure you don't want to consider relocating until we can sort this out?" The suggestion of running away triggered a response that surprised Maggie with its intensity. She had spent 8 years building a life in Pine Ridge, had found peace in the routine and solitude of her farmhouse, and had finally begun to believe that she could leave the violence of her past behind. The idea of abandoning everything she had worked for because criminals wanted to steal her home filled her with a cold fury that reminded her why she had been so effective as a military sniper. "No, Colonel, I'm not running. They picked the wrong person to threaten, and I'm going to make sure they understand that." The next morning brought an escalation that crossed a line Maggie had hoped her enemies wouldn't be foolish enough to cross. She was checking her perimeter security devices when she discovered that someone had attempted to breach her property during the night. The motion detectors around her eastern boundary had been triggered at approximately 3 a.m., and fresh tracks in the soft earth showed that at least 2 people had approached to within 50 yards of her house. More troubling was the discovery that someone had attempted to cut the power line that supplied electricity to her property. The cut was incomplete, apparently abandoned when the intruders realized that the line was equipped with backup systems that would maintain power even if the main supply was severed. But the attempt demonstrated that her enemies were prepared to use tactics that could endanger her life, not just threaten her property. The final straw came when Maggie drove to town for supplies and discovered that her truck's brake lines had been cut. She realized the sabotage only when the brakes failed to respond as she approached the stop sign at Main Street and Pine Ridge Road, forcing her to use the emergency brake and steer into a snowbank to avoid a collision with cross traffic. As she sat in her damaged truck, surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been a simple trip to town, Maggie felt something shift inside her mind. The careful control that had allowed her to live peacefully for 8 years was finally overwhelmed by the tactical thinking that had kept her alive in combat zones around the world. She was no longer Margaret Sullivan, the quiet woman who grew vegetables and kept to herself. She was Staff Sergeant Margaret Sullivan, Special Operations Forces sniper, confirmed kills classified, and someone had just declared war on her. That afternoon, Maggie began implementing a response plan that drew on every skill she had learned in 15 years of military service. Her first step was intelligence gathering, using techniques she had mastered in Afghanistan to identify and track her enemies. The surveillance equipment she placed around Pine Ridge was military grade, nearly impossible to detect, and capable of monitoring communications as well as movement.
Within 24 hours, she had identified the location where Thornton and his associates were operating, a rental house on the outskirts of town that served as a temporary command post for their operation. Her reconnaissance revealed that the operation was larger and more sophisticated than she had initially realized. At least 6 people were involved, including Thornton, Davis, and 4 others who showed the training and equipment of professional security contractors. They had established a communications center, maintained surveillance of multiple properties in the area, and were coordinating with unknown contacts outside the immediate area. More importantly, Maggie's surveillance revealed that she wasn't their only target. 3 other property owners in Pine Ridge were receiving similar pressure, and she intercepted communications suggesting that at least one of them had already agreed to sell after receiving threats against family members. The intelligence changed her perspective on the situation entirely. This wasn't just about her property or even just about the development project that Thornton claimed to represent. Someone was running a systematic campaign to acquire large amounts of rural land for purposes that went far beyond legitimate development, and they were using methods that suggested connections to organized crime or worse. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after Thornton's first visit, Maggie received the phone call she had been expecting. "Sullivan, this is Richard Thornton. I trust you've had sufficient time to reconsider our offer." "I have, and my answer hasn't changed. I'm not selling my property." "That's unfortunate, because circumstances have changed somewhat since our last conversation. You see, we've discovered that your property has some environmental issues that are going to require immediate attention from state regulators. There's also the matter of those building code violations that need to be addressed, and I understand your bank accounts have been frozen pending resolution of some legal complications." Thornton's voice carried a smugness that made it clear he knew exactly how those complications had arisen. He was presenting himself as someone who might be able to help solve problems that he had created, a classic intimidation tactic used by criminals and corrupt officials around the world. "I'm sure all of those issues will be resolved in due time, Mr. Brefman." "Thornton, perhaps, but I should mention that we've become aware of some concerns about your background that might complicate things further. You see, we've done some research into your military service, and there are questions about your psychological fitness that might interest local law enforcement." The threat was more specific now, suggesting that Thornton had access to classified information about her military record and was prepared to use it against her. Maggie felt the familiar calm that preceded combat operations settling over her mind. "What exactly are you implying, Mr. Thornton?" "I'm not implying anything, Miss Sullivan. I'm stating facts. You're a former military sniper with confirmed kills and a history of violent action in foreign conflicts. You live alone, you're isolated from your community, and you've been exhibiting increasingly paranoid behavior. If something unfortunate were to happen, say a confrontation with local law enforcement or an accident involving firearms, well, I think most people would find it quite believable." The threat was unmistakable now. Thornton was telling her that they were prepared to manufacture a situation that would result in her death, probably arranged to look like a confrontation with police or a tragic accident. The mention of her military record meant that they had access to information that should have been classified, suggesting connections that reached into government agencies or military databases. "I think we're done talking, Mr. Thornton. I hope you'll reconsider one final time, Miss Solwu. Sullivan. We'll be in the area for the rest of the week, and after that, other people will be handling this matter. People who might not be as interested in reaching a peaceful resolution." The call ended with what amounted to a death threat, and Maggie knew that she had reached the point where further attempts at peaceful resolution were impossible. Her enemies had escalated to direct threats against her life, which meant that she was now authorized by every principle of self-defense to respond with whatever force was necessary to protect herself. That night, Maggie made final preparations for a confrontation that she knew was coming within the next 24 to 48 hours. Weapons were positioned throughout her property, ammunition was distributed to multiple caches, and escape routes were planned and rehearsed. She sent a detailed message to Colonel Morrison explaining the situation and her planned response, along with instructions for what to do if she didn't check in within 72 hours. As she settled into a defensive position that provided clear fields of fire across her property, Maggie reflected on the irony of her situation. She had left the military hoping to find peace in civilian life, only to discover that some battles followed you wherever you went. But if Thornton and his associates thought they could intimidate a Special Operations Forces sniper into abandoning her home, they were about to learn that some quiet women were quiet for very dangerous reasons.
The war for Pine Ridge was about to begin, and Margaret Sullivan was ready to remind the world exactly how effective she had been when fighting was her full-time profession. The attack came at 3:47 a.m. on Friday morning, exactly the time that Maggie's military experience had taught her to expect. It was the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness was naturally at its lowest, and when most people would be deep in sleep. But Maggie hadn't been sleeping. She had been waiting in a concealed position on the second floor of her house, watching the approaches to her property through night vision equipment that turned the darkness into green-tinted visibility. She detected the first intruder when he was still 400 yards away, moving through the tree line that bordered her eastern property boundary. The man was good, using proper spacing and sound discipline as he advanced, but he wasn't good enough to avoid detection by someone who had spent years hunting human targets in hostile territory. Maggie tracked his movement through her scope, noting his equipment and tactics as he approached. The intruder was wearing military-style gear, including body armor, night vision goggles, and communications equipment that suggested professional training and significant financial backing. His weapon appeared to be an assault rifle configured for close-quarters combat, and his movement patterns indicated familiarity with small-unit tactics. This wasn't a criminal trying to intimidate a homeowner. This was a trained operator conducting a military-style assault. Within minutes, Maggie had identified 3 more intruders approaching from different directions, confirming her assessment that she was facing a coordinated attack by a professional team. They were using textbook small-unit tactics, with overwatch positions and mutual support that would have been effective against most civilian targets. But Maggie wasn't most civilian targets, and she had advantages that her attackers didn't know about. The converted barn behind her house contained more than just a shooting range. Hidden compartments throughout the building held military-grade communications equipment, night vision systems, and weapons that most civilians never saw outside of action movies. More importantly, the barn was connected to her house by an underground tunnel that she had constructed during her first year in Pine Ridge, a project that her neighbors had assumed was related to installing a new septic system. As the intruders closed to within 200 yards of her house, Maggie began implementing a defensive strategy that drew on every lesson she had learned in 15 years of military service. Her first priority was to disrupt their communications and coordination, which she accomplished by activating a signal jammer that she had acquired through military surplus channels years earlier. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The attacking team's disciplined advance suddenly became confused and disorganized as their radios and night vision equipment began malfunctioning. Without reliable communication, they couldn't coordinate their movements or call for backup, which transformed their tactical advantage into a liability that Maggie was prepared to exploit. Her first shot was fired from a position in her attic, through a window that provided clear fields of fire across her front yard. The target was the team leader, identifiable by his equipment and position relative to the other attackers. At a range of 180 yards, using a rifle that she had zeroed for much longer distances, the shot was almost insultingly easy for someone of her skill level. The .300 Winchester Magnum round struck her target's center mass, punching through his body armor and dropping him instantly. The sound of the shot echoed across the hills around Pine Ridge, a deep boom that announced to anyone within miles that serious weaponry was being used in what most people would assume was an early morning hunting expedition. The death of their team leader threw the remaining attackers into confusion that was compounded by their communication failures and the darkness that made it difficult to identify the source of the sniper fire. Maggie used their disorientation to reposition to a different firing point, moving through her house with the speed and silence that came from years of practice. Her second shot came from a bedroom window on the opposite side of the house, targeting an intruder who was attempting to flank her position by moving through the vegetable garden behind her house. The range was shorter this time, less than 100 yards, and her target was moving across open ground with no concealment. The shot was as effective as the first, and suddenly the attacking force had been reduced from 4 men to 2. The surviving attackers finally recognized that they were facing someone with professional military training rather than a civilian homeowner who could be easily overwhelmed. One of them began retreating toward the tree line, while the other attempted to establish a defensive position behind Maggie's pickup truck in her driveway. Maggie's third shot demonstrated why she had been considered one of the most effective snipers in Special Operations Forces. Her target was partially concealed behind her truck, presenting only a small portion of his head and shoulder as a viable aiming point. At a range of 150 yards, in darkness, with only the ambient light of stars for visibility, most marksmen would have considered the shot extremely difficult. For Margaret Sullivan, it was just another confirmed kill. The round struck her target precisely where she had aimed, and the threat was eliminated with the same professional efficiency that had made her legendary among her military peers. The surviving attacker finally made the intelligent decision to retreat, abandoning the assault and disappearing into the forest with the speed of someone who understood that he was facing a superior opponent. Maggie tracked his movement through her night vision scope but chose not to pursue. Her training had taught her that eliminating fleeing enemies could create legal complications, and she preferred to let the survivor carry word back to his employers about what happened when professionals tried to intimidate Margaret Sullivan. By 4:30 a.m., the Battle of Pine Ridge was over. 3 bodies lay scattered around Maggie's property, and she began the process of dealing with the aftermath of the first combat action she had engaged in since leaving the military. Her first call was to Colonel Morrison using a secure satellite phone that couldn't be monitored by local authorities. "Colonel, this is Maggie. The situation has escalated to active combat. 3 hostiles down. 1 escaped. I need immediate assistance with cleanup and legal protection." Morrison's response was swift and decisive. "I'm activating military liaison protocols immediately. Do not contact local law enforcement. Federal authorities will be taking jurisdiction over this incident, and you'll have legal representation within 6 hours. Are you injured?" Negative. The hostiles were eliminated before they could engage effectively. But, Colonel, this was a professional military assault team, not civilian contractors. Someone with serious resources and connections is behind this operation. Understood. I've been developing intelligence on Summit Development Group, and what I'm finding suggests connections to international criminal organizations and possibly foreign intelligence services. This may be bigger than property development, Maggie. You may have stumbled into something involving national security. While waiting for federal authorities to arrive, Maggie conducted a systematic search of the bodies and equipment left behind by the attackers. What she discovered confirmed Morrison's assessment and explained why someone with military-grade resources had been deployed against a single civilian target. The weapons carried by the attackers were military surplus, but modified with equipment that wasn't available through normal civilian channels. Their body armor bore manufacturer markings that suggested origin from Eastern European military suppliers, and their communications equipment was configured for frequencies used by intelligence agencies rather than civilian security contractors. Most tellingly, one of the dead men carried identification that identified him as a former member of a special forces unit that had been disbanded years earlier following involvement in unauthorized operations in several foreign countries. The presence of discharged Special Forces personnel suggested that someone with extensive military connections was recruiting experienced operators for missions that required lethal force. By the time federal agents arrived at Maggie's property, she had assembled enough evidence to support the conclusion that she had been targeted by an organization that went far beyond simple real estate development. The attack on her property had been planned and executed with the kind of precision that suggested either foreign intelligence involvement or domestic criminal organizations with access to military-grade resources and personnel. The FBI team that took control of the crime scene was led by Special Agent Sarah Chen, a woman whose calm professionalism and obvious familiarity with military protocols suggested extensive experience with cases involving former Special Operations personnel. Chen's first conversation with Maggie established the framework for what would become a complex federal investigation. "Ms. Sullivan, I want you to understand that what happened here tonight is being treated as a matter of national security. The attackers you eliminated were carrying equipment and identification that suggests connections to international criminal organizations that we've been investigating for several months. Your actions may have disrupted an operation that goes far beyond property development in Pine Ridge." Chen explained that Summit Development Group was suspected of being a front organization for a network that used legitimate business activities to conceal money laundering, human trafficking, and weapons smuggling operations across multiple states. The rural properties they were acquiring were believed to be intended for use as logistics bases and safe houses for criminal activities that required isolation from law enforcement surveillance. "Sullivan, Based on your military background and the effectiveness of your defensive actions tonight, I'm prepared to offer you a deal. We need someone with your skills and knowledge of this operation to help us track down the larger network that was behind the attack on your property. In exchange, you'll have full legal immunity for tonight's events and federal protection for as long as necessary. The offer to rejoin the war against enemies of the United States, even in a civilian capacity, triggered feelings that Maggie had thought she had left behind years earlier. The prospect of using her military skills for something more meaningful than protecting her vegetable garden appealed to parts of her personality that civilian life had never fully satisfied. But first, she had to deal with the immediate consequences of the battle that had transformed her peaceful farmhouse into a crime scene that would be studied by federal investigators for weeks to come. News of the incident would eventually reach Pine Ridge, and she would need to decide how much of the truth to share with neighbors who had known her only as the quiet woman who kept to herself. As dawn broke over the hills around Pine Ridge, revealing the full scope of the previous night's violence, Maggie realized that her quiet life was over forever. Whether she chose to help the federal investigation or simply relocate to another peaceful community, she would never again be able to pretend that Margaret Sullivan was just another civilian trying to leave the past behind. The world had reminded her that some skills were too valuable to be permanently retired, and some enemies were too dangerous to be faced by anyone other than professionals who understood that freedom sometimes required violence to protect it. The quiet woman of Pine Ridge had become a warrior again, and this time she was fighting for more than just her own property. 6 months after the Battle of Pine Ridge, Margaret Sullivan sat in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of senators who were struggling to comprehend the scope of the criminal network that had been unraveled as a result of her actions. The quiet woman who had once grown vegetables and kept to herself was now the star witness in one of the largest organized crime investigations in recent American history. The operation that had begun with attempts to force her off her property had ultimately exposed a network of international criminals who were using rural American real estate to establish infrastructure for human trafficking, drug distribution, and money laundering operations that extended across multiple continents. Summit Development Group had been just the tip of an iceberg that included corrupt government officials, foreign intelligence operatives, and criminal organizations from Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia. Special Agent Sarah Chen sat beside Maggie at the witness table, surrounded by boxes of evidence that represented months of investigation following the attack on Maggie's farmhouse. The federal operation that had resulted from that night had led to arrests in 12 states and 3 foreign countries, with seizures of assets totaling more than $200 million. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward as she addressed Maggie directly. "Ms. Sullivan, I want to make sure I understand correctly. You're telling us that this entire network was discovered because criminals tried to steal your vegetable garden?" The question drew scattered laughter from the gallery, but Maggie's response was delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her military service. "Senator, they weren't interested in my vegetables. They needed my property because it provided access to transportation routes and isolation from law enforcement surveillance. What they didn't anticipate was that their target had the training and equipment necessary to defend herself." The story that emerged during the hearings revealed the true scope of the operation that had targeted Pine Ridge. The criminal network had been systematically acquiring rural properties across the American Midwest, creating a logistics infrastructure that allowed them to move illegal goods and people across the country without detection. The isolated locations were perfect for activities that required freedom from government oversight, and the sparse population meant that unusual activity was less likely to be reported to authorities. Richard Thornton, it turned out, was a mid-level operative in an organization that included former intelligence officers from several countries, discharged military personnel from elite units, and business executives who provided legitimate cover for criminal activities. The attack on Maggie's property had been authorized at the highest levels of the organization after she demonstrated that she couldn't be intimidated through normal pressure tactics. "What makes this case particularly significant," Agent Chen testified, "is that Miss Sullivan's background and training allowed her to recognize and respond to threats that would have overwhelmed civilian targets. Her military experience provided capabilities that enabled her to survive an assault that was intended to eliminate a potential witness to criminal activities. The federal investigation had benefited enormously from the intelligence that Maggie had gathered before and during the attack on her property. Her surveillance equipment had recorded communications that provided crucial evidence about the organization's structure and operations, and her tactical response had captured equipment and documents that led investigators to additional cells of the network. Senator James Morrison, Colonel Morrison's brother and a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, addressed the broader implications of the case. This investigation raises serious questions about how criminal organizations are exploiting rural America and whether we have adequate resources to detect and respond to such operations. Sullivan's case demonstrates that our national security may depend more on the vigilance of individual citizens than we have previously recognized. The hearings also revealed details about Maggie's military service that had been classified for years. Her role as a Special Operations Forces sniper had involved missions that remained sensitive even years after her discharge, but the committee received classified briefings that explained why her skills had been so effective against the criminal organization. Colonel Morrison testified about the broader implications of the case for military veterans transitioning to civilian life. Ms. Sullivan represents thousands of former Special Operations personnel who have skills that are valuable for national security, but who are trying to build peaceful lives after military service. This case demonstrates that those skills may be needed even after they've left active duty, and that we need better systems for supporting veterans who find themselves facing threats that require their specialized training. The investigation had also uncovered corruption within local and state government agencies that had been providing assistance to the criminal network. The building inspector who had harassed Maggie about code violations had been receiving payments for targeting property owners who refused to sell to Summit Development Group. The banker who had frozen her accounts had been coerced through threats against her family, and several other local officials had been compromised through bribery or intimidation. These revelations had shocked the residents of Pine Ridge, who had never suspected that their quiet community was being targeted by international criminals. The town had become the focus of national media attention, with reporters struggling to understand how a place known primarily for its annual Harvest Festival had become the center of a major organized crime investigation. Jimmy Torres, the mail carrier who had interacted with Maggie more than most Pine Ridge residents, testified about his observations during the months preceding the attack. "I knew something was wrong when those fancy cars started showing up around town. People in Pine Ridge don't drive vehicles that cost more than most of our houses, and they don't wear suits that expensive either. But I never imagined it was anything like this." Dr. Sarah Kim, who had treated Maggie during her years in Pine Ridge, provided testimony about the psychological challenges faced by military veterans trying to adjust to civilian life. Miss Persecute. "Sullivan came to me because she was experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress and adjustment disorders. She was trying very hard to leave her military experiences behind and build a normal civilian life. What happened to her demonstrates that sometimes the past doesn't stay in the past, especially for people who have served in special operations roles." The hearings also addressed questions about the legal and ethical implications of Maggie's response to the attack on her property. While federal authorities had determined that her actions were legally justified as self-defense, some committee members expressed concerns about the precedent of civilians engaging in military-style combat operations against criminal organizations. Senator David Chen raised these concerns during his questioning. "Ms. Sullivan, while we all appreciate your service to this country and recognize that you were defending your home, I'm troubled by the implications of civilians taking the law into their own hands. How do we balance individual rights to self-defense with the need to maintain law and order through proper legal channels?" Maggie's response reflected the perspective of someone who had spent years in situations where legal channels were inadequate for ensuring survival. "Senator, with respect, when armed men attack your home in the middle of the night, legal channels are not an option. My choice was to defend myself or to die. The investigation that resulted from my survival has led to the arrest of criminals who were threatening the safety of communities across multiple states. Sometimes individual action is necessary to protect the broader public good." The committee's final report would ultimately commend Maggie's actions and recommend changes to federal law enforcement procedures to better detect and respond to criminal organizations that target rural communities. The report also recommended improved support services for military veterans with specialized training who might be called upon to use their skills in civilian contexts. But for Maggie, the most significant outcome of the investigation was the realization that her quiet life in Pine Ridge had been an illusion from the beginning. The skills and experiences that she had tried to leave behind were not burdens to be overcome, but resources that could be used to protect others who faced similar threats. Agent Chen had offered her a position with a joint task force that specialized in investigating criminal organizations with international connections, a role that would allow her to use her military training for law enforcement purposes. The work would be dangerous and would require her to travel frequently, but it would also provide a sense of purpose that civilian life had never offered. As she prepared to leave Washington and return to Pine Ridge to pack her belongings, Maggie reflected on the irony of her situation. She had left the military hoping to find peace in civilian life, only to discover that peace was something that had to be actively protected against people who sought to destroy it. Her vegetable garden and quiet routine had been pleasant, but they had never provided the satisfaction that came from using her abilities to accomplish something meaningful. The attack on her property had been intended to eliminate a potential obstacle to criminal activities, but it had instead awakened a warrior who had been sleeping for 8 years. Margaret Sullivan was no longer the quiet woman of Pine Ridge. She was once again a guardian, protector, and hunter of those who threatened the safety and security of innocent people. The final irony was that the criminals who had tried to force her off her land had succeeded, but not in the way they had intended. She was leaving Pine Ridge not as a victim, but as someone who had discovered that her true calling was not growing vegetables, but growing justice in a world that often seemed short of both. As her plane lifted off from Washington, carrying her toward a new life that would blend her military skills with law enforcement objectives, Maggie looked down at the landscape below and smiled. Somewhere down there, other quiet women and men were living peaceful lives, unaware that their safety depended on people who were willing to fight when fighting was necessary. The quiet woman had learned that silence was sometimes the prelude to violence, and that the most dangerous people in the world were often those who appeared to be the most harmless. She was ready to use that knowledge to protect others who deserved the chance to live peacefully, even if peace required warriors to maintain it. The battle for Pine Ridge was over, but the war for justice was just beginning, and Margaret Sullivan was exactly where she belonged, in the fight.